Cass Pennant, what's a hooligan?
He's a gang member that causes football violence on the football stadiums and the terraces. Goes back years since football began, but really in the modern world it was something that developed after in the late 60s on the back of a subculture.
How did it develop?
Really sort of around 1966 England won the World Cup, and the world, the nation was in a peace mode. Your teachers were hippies. The whole theme was peace and war because of the Vietnam War. And in nature you always get backlashes, and a skinhead culture, a violent youth culture developed with teenagers in Britain on the back of a fashion, and it was aggressive. It introduced gang violence, and once authorities that didn't know this underground movement was so violent, and once they realised that it had gone nationwide and they clamped down on it, the only way youths and gangs could gather was on the football terraces. And they sort of took up the identity behind the football goals in the late 60s. And you had something in 1969, what they called a spirit of 69. And what they meant by that was the skinhead culture that started in London, where we are now, spread the whole UK. And then from that moment onwards, with the media and newspapers, the football violence and the headlines that we know today really comes from that. It's quite a modern phenomenon.
Where did the term hooligans come from?
Hooligan, the sociologists would tell you, comes from a family, an Irish family of ruffians back in the early 19th century from South London. So the name hooligan and hooligan was a play on that.
What was or is the ICF?
The ICF is probably Britain's most notorious football hooligan gang. It's associated with my team. I supported West Ham, so they were West Ham fans, and they took the name ICF from the way they travelled, which was first class intercity trains. And at the time, football travel was cheap, special trains. They didn't think it was a working class movement. They didn't think working class fans and youth could afford to travel first class. So it was taking the gang culture up another level, and it's hit a period that's kind of addressed by the films today, and it's really kind of almost authenticated the whole movement today, because it at the time people thought they stereotyped the football hooligan as someone that's right-wing, working class and a skinhead, but by then it had moved into people from all walks of life that had jobs. Some were middle classes and rather business-like, so they become firms instead of gangs. And the intercity firm was sort of introduced that when it introduced the calling card, and the gangs become organised, rather like in a business-like way, but the business was violence.
Is this culture singular to England?
No. I mean, obviously it spread to international level. And because of the media and the news, it got picked up in Europe and then copied. It went from the clubs to international level, particularly with the England following. It caused worldwide headlines. And then youth culture. I mean, Britain's always given the world every youth culture, I would say, you know, from the Teddy Boys to the mods, you know, punk, you name it, every sort of, even a skinhead. There was no skinhead in the world till it come from Britain, you know what I mean? Now all around the world, it's kind of mixed in with music and fashion. It's not just the football, it's a whole subculture and a scene. You know, I always say that violence was 90 seconds, the match was 90 minutes, but the youth would talk about the football scene the whole weekend, so something more was going on. There's an underbelly thing. And it's interesting today, because today I've moved into films and do a lot of research, with books, take me around the world, and I meet different cultures from Europe. And it's interesting, when I was in Russia just the other year, we copied a lot of the fashion styles from Italy, and they're called ultras in Europe. Same thing, ultras, passionate fans that take the passion to violence, are known as ultras. and that's what we call hooligans. And they turn around and say, we copy the British subculture. We're wearing British fashions and into British bands like the Cockney Rejects. So it's kind of U-turn, and today it's kind of moved into Eastern Europe. So Russia, South America, Asia now picking up on the casual culture, which all basically was a fashion, a music and a style that come from the back of Terrace's. And sinister undertones of violence associated with it.
Cass Pennant, what was your role in the ICF?
Well, we've got to look into my background. Really, I was a Dr. Banano's kid. I was adopted, and I was brought up in Britain.
I'm sorry, adopted?
Yeah.
Bananas?
Dr. Banano's.
Dr. Bernardo's
Yeah,
kid.
it's a fostering and adoption agency.
Okay.
Quite famous. At 6 weeks old, I was taken up by two white parents. So the mother and father were both white, and I lived in a white town, and the nearest black person or community was 5 towns away. So this is Britain before it was multicultural. And like I told you, when I was about 11, all this gang culture erupted with the skinhead culture, and I was always bullied as a kid, and so I had to fight my way to the equality.
Why were you bullied?
Because I was black and different, and I was big for my size. So it's Britain before it was multicultural. So, you know, a lot of people today say that's pure racism. But when you're brought up with that, even TV and even establishment, everything else was pretty similar, the same problems. It was more an ignorance of a culture. But there's no help to me. And I found equality only through fighting. And with the gang culture, suddenly had the use. So once I started going to football with the gangs and I saw the use, when I went to West Ham, something different happened. For once, I wasn't seen as black. It wasn't an issue of black and white. My whole day, from the time I left home to go to school and come back again, was always an issue of black and white. When I went to football, my team, West Ham, played in the colours of claret and blue. And for the first time ever, I was accepted. And the people accepting me was a football gang. So as I grew up, my loyalty was to the gang. It was like I wanted to prove to the world that I'm worth something. And it happened to be a football gang. And once you get involved in that culture, there's only one ending. And I ended up in prison at a very young age.
Why?
For football violence, causing a riot.
In a stadium, outside a stadium?
Outside a stadium. There was a cup final, cup match involving my team. A rival team was a mile away. It was a bad night of violence. Fans were seriously injured, and it reached government level now that the time has come to do something about it. The public was screaming for example to be made, and I happened to be that example, so I ended up in the highest court. Were
you a leader of ICF at the time? Were you treated fairly?
Yeah, I was pretty influential at the time. Yeah, I was one of the ringleaders, and the press at the time, when I come to the Old Bailey and was made an example, I was actually the first football fan to be given a lengthy custodial sentence. So it's the first time from that age of being unknown, suddenly I was on every newspaper. At the age of 20, I was in Wormwood Scrubs prison. Radio shows were debating me. There was talk in Parliament on the problems of football violence. It seemed to be the whole world was debating me, and I just sat in prison thinking I come from low working class, not an education that would take me anywhere, didn't feel I'd have a worth. And the whole conversation, the whole that year I was in prison seemed to be about rehabilitation, seemed to be the mood. And I was aware in prison that I was a young man. When I come out, they were talking about rehabilitation and change, but how do you change when you're that young and you're single and you've got no responsibility to no one? I knew when I come out, the gang would be waiting for me. So I looked at myself, because you're banged up 23 hours, and the fact that I was in all these newspapers and people were talking about us and talking about my gang, and I felt they misunderstand us, they do not know us. The people I met, we got a different story. And so I couldn't figure out